Today at Creative Mind, Kimberly from the United States. With her long living and working experience in China, she consults companies regarding their business in China. The interview will start with a brief introduction of Kimberly, and then she will move on talking about business cases she experienced in her daily business.
I am the owner of a company called International Resource Development, and it's primarily a consulting company. We work with a variety of companies in different industries, chemical companies, industrial manufacturing companies, some consumer product companies, from 10 million to multi-billions of dollars, and primarily work with them on international operations improvement, mostly between the US and China, but also we've have projects in Vietnam. I had meetings last year in Switzerland and France with clients that had business in China or internationally. So that's the tall, high level version of what we do.
Okay. So we've already talked, and I think you have some interesting stories, especially regarding China to tell, some business cases. Maybe we can just start with that.
Okay, sure. I always tell people the easiest way to explain what I do is to describe a few of the current or recent projects that we have.
Yeah.
So, one of the companies, I first started working with them about 10 years ago. They had been selling into China a product that goes to commercial customers as well as to individual retail customers. Fairly expensive item, about $700. So not a consumable product. And at the time, they had really big sales in Taiwan and not very many sales in China. And they obviously there's a huge size difference of the market between Taiwan and China. So
Yeah.
to them, it didn't make any sense why they had so little sales in China. So the first thing that we did with them 10 years ago was kind of a market research and marketing channel entry plan for China. And what we told them was the problem was they were using the same Taiwanese distributor that was working with them in Taiwan was working with them in China. And the Taiwanese and the Chinese are kind of like the Israelis and the Palestinians. So having the Israelis help you get into Palestine is probably not the best idea. And it's the same with having the Taiwanese help you enter the Chinese market. They used this product differently in Taiwan than they would in China, so they didn't have the right application for it. They weren't communicating to customers the right way. So our first recommendation was to find a different distributor, to customize how their product would be used in China so that it could meet the market. We felt they had a tremendous opportunity in terms of sales. They could have 50 times the sales of what they had in Taiwan quite easily. But then the company ended up, and this is, all part of kind of how companies work. The company ended up having a really they got into online sales in the US, which they had been resisting. And they developed a kind of a lower cost $200 model. And they started selling it online in the US. And that hit so huge, so fast, that they didn't have enough production capacity to even try to expand the market in China at the time. So they took my carefully crafted ideas and report and put it in a filing cabinet, which really irritated me. I don't know why I care because I got paid, but I knew that they had a great opportunity in China. So they put it away, and then after about 7 or 8 years, that they had more competition in the U.S. A startup company kind of came after them because they had a huge lion's share of that market. So then they
Okay.
suddenly had competition, and their online U.S. sales decreased, and suddenly they wanted to dust off, the international report and see what they could do. So we helped them a little bit. They found a distributor on their own. And in China, they started working with this new distributor. And then they called me a couple of years later. They had regulatory problems. Their product needs to be CCC certified, which is the Chinese version of the CE mark. And they had been managing that themselves. And then someone decided in the organization to allow this distributor to manage the application process for a new kind of price sensitive product. Well, it turns out they got audited and found that the Chinese government found that their application file for the CCC certification, the product, the distributor used incorrect photos. So they probably couldn't photograph the motor that was actually being used, or they couldn't identify it. So rather than ask, they just inserted photos from a different motor. So when the government audited the product, they said your application files don't match what you're actually selling. So you need to go through the whole process again, and we could potentially force you to yank all of your products out of China and ship them back to the US and start again, which would have been disastrous. So at the time, I helped them manage and negotiate with the government quality regulatory agency who came to the US to inspect their plant, and how to present, a better face of, we're really sorry, it was the distributor, we should have paid more attention, we didn't. So that was about 3 years ago. So this year they called me and said, okay, we want to move product from that distributor to a new distributor in China. And in Europe or in the United States, this sounds fairly easy, right? We're going to take product that distributor A has paid us for, and we're going to have distributor B purchase that product and become the reseller of it now. But then they had two small wrinkles. Distributor A didn't want to sell it directly to distributor B because they were pissed off that they were being replaced. Distributor B didn't want to put out $6 million worth of money to buy the inventory until it was sold, online. It was going on Taobao and Tmall, the Chinese version of like Amazon and eBay. So they came to me and said, how can we do this? Can we in the US pay the distributor A, have them ship the product to distributor B, and distributor B can pay us back? And I said, the problem with that is Chinese government is extremely unimaginative. So if you have the goods staying within the country, but you have the money coming from outside of the country to buy the goods, and then the goods are going to someone else, and then that someone else is selling them and not paying you for it, it's beyond what customs and SAFE, which is the state agency for foreign exchange, and the banks, it's beyond the linear way of looking at the transaction for them to understand. So typically the Chinese government wants the money, the goods, and the documents to all align. So you should have a document that says, if the US is paying the money, the US is owning the goods, and the goods are coming to the US. So if the goods are going documented to someone else and they're physically going to someone else, then it's a mismatch, and it's hard for them to understand. But I told them the option they had was to use a free trade zone in China, because officially the free trade zone is out of the country. So they could ship the product to the free trade zone, have it officially export, become owned by the US, and then re-import it into China. Now they had extra costs for this because they have import duties a second time. They have VAT tax a second time, although they would get a VAT tax rebate on the export. We'd have to figure out and calculate the costs. But I said, my other concern is we had this regulatory issue a few years ago. And, if you guys didn't completely settle that out, if it's still a problem, when you export and want to re-import, you may have trouble with this product. And at the time, I'm talking to the controller and the CFO and the operations people, and they were like, oh, we think it's okay, or they didn't really answer me directly. And I kept kind of saying, don't you want to check on the regulatory? So a month later, they called me back and said, yeah, we can't do that. We got them quotes from a free trade zone and had everything set up. And they said, we can't do that because of the regulatory issue. And I'm like, yeah, thought so. So they came back and said, now what other options do we have? And so one of them is that the distributor B company has a parent company in Canada and a sister company in Hong Kong. So because the issue is, how do we get the money into China, not officially into China, so that distributor B has cash flow to buy the product from distributor A, and they're not paying it out of their own pocket. So the US company could lend the money, and have a loan document to the Hong Kong parent company of distributor B. And then they could do intercompany payments so that they're basically building up sister company of distributor B in Hong Kong can build up some cash of distributor B in China. And that way they can use the loan we're giving Hong Kong, because it's easier to move money across borders between related entities. And I'm always saying to people, there's a difference between tax planning and tax fraud. Tax planning is creative, but it's still within the law, right? And people may not
Yeah.
like it. And this is what a lot of multi-billionaires and multimillionaires do, is tax planning to get away from
Yeah.
paying taxes. Everything's legal, but it's, maybe some people might say it's pushing the bounds of ethical or moral because you're taking advantage of things, but it's not tax fraud. So we want to stay on the tax planning side of things with this. So I gave them those options in terms of the loan documents and how to write it. The other wrinkle in this that's very interesting is distributor B had what I would call a predatory contract. So distributor B's contract said to the US, we will, when you ship, let's take distributor A out of it. When the US ships this product into China to distributor B won't own it. They'll import it for you and they'll sell it for you, but they'll never actually take ownership of it according to their contract. And I said, here's the problem. According to logic and law and the Chinese government and tax authorities, distributor B will own it because they are the importer of record, and they're bringing it into the country, they're holding it, they're selling it to customers, they're collecting money from the customers. So they have actually bought it from you and they're paying you back the money. So they can write whatever they want in their contract about how they don't own it, because they're trying to get away from the liability of owning it and paying taxes on it and push all of that onto the American company. But in fact, in reality, they are buying it and reselling it, and they become the owner. So the fact that they're trying to push that off in contract on the US means that either they don't have the right type of entity in China to do trading like that, or they're trying to play games and avoid taxes, which again is a problem. So that's been a very interesting,
Yeah.
project all the way around. Ready for another one?
Yeah, of course. I'm totally listening. I'm totally up. Really interesting. Just keep
Okay,
going.
because I geek out on this kind of thing. It's not everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah.
But I have another client that's a US company that's owned what's called a Wolfie, a wholly owned foreign entity in China, which is a manufacturing company. And they've had this company for 10 years. And it's been somewhat profitable. They primarily make and ship product back to the US for them to sell to their customers. They have some sales in China. I think their intention was to develop more sales in China, and they weren't able to do that. So they were looking at, especially with the tariffs and now the virus, they were looking at, should they keep the factory? Should they close the factory? So they reached out to a business broker in China to see if they could potentially sell the business. And the broker found them a fantastic opportunity. Where their factory is located in Guangzhou, it's in a much older manufacturing industrial area that's closer to the commercial and residential area. And it's expected over the next few years, it will be rezoned as residential. So the broker found a buyer who's a real estate developer, who really doesn't care about the company, the manufacturing part of the company. He wants the real estate. They have a 50-year lease on this land and building, and he thinks if he buys the company and therefore owns the real estate lease, he could have it rezoned and double the value of that land in putting up apartment blocks, apartment buildings. So basically, this company, if the US shut down the factory without selling it, it would probably cost them close to $1 million. They'd have to pay severance to 100 employees. They would have to wind down the building. They'd have to take out the equipment. They, have to close the company up. And which in itself is expensive and can often take 2 years just to completely wind down and officially close a company, even a simple company. On the flip side, if they sold the manufacturing business to another manufacturer, they might get $2 or $3 million at the most. And of that, they'd spend $1 million closing it down. So really not, neither of those options are fantastic. This real estate deal, the real estate company is paying 16 million US dollars for this land.
Mm-hmm.
So here on option A, the company would have been out of pocket $1 million. On option B, they might have made $1 million or $2 million. Here they stand to make $15 million just off of the land. So the American owners are thrilled, right? Excited. And one of US government commercial services, they were in contact with them with questions on paperwork and documents, and the US government referred me to help them with the transaction. And what I've been doing is, it's the broker is in China, and the gentleman they're great, the two people that we're working with, but they really don't understand American business and income tax and transactions. And then the Chinese real estate owner is very domestic, China based, and doesn't have any international experience. And then the US customer has had the factory in China for 10 years, but they really don't understand transferring ownership of businesses and transactions like that. So I ended up kind of taking over the final part of the contract writing and negotiation with their lawyers, because there were just misunderstandings between the two about why, what the US company's Chinese lawyer would insist on adding 10 things. And the Americans couldn't be sure, were those just being careful? Were they critical? How important was it? And so I was able to go through that and say, this one you need to really insist on. These other 5 are not that meaningful. It won't matter down the road. But you need to be careful with these 2. And, I'm helping in the discussion. I'm a very, get it done person. So helping in the discussion to take the conversation and streamline it and say, okay, this is what you want. This is what you want. Here's where we can meet in the middle. Do we agree? Yes or no? And help to kind of move it to ending. So they signed the contract last week, which was great. And now the way the contract is structured, the buyer, real estate buyer, really doesn't want the company, and meaning he doesn't want 100 employees and customers buying this equipment. So he wants all of that gone before he fully takes over the business. But the Americans don't want to wind down the whole company when they don't have any money from the buyer. So the buyer is going to pay a 20% deposit, or a little over $3 million, to the Americans. But the way the deal is structured is that the buyer then gets 20% equity in the business. And then after everything is wound down, the buyer will pay for the other 80% and take over the business completely. And the goal is between 6 to 9 months to make that happen, because it's extremely complicated. And I'm working with them on this part of it also. It's extremely complicated to terminate employees in China. They're on labor contracts, there's standard severance amounts. It's very difficult. So the labor part of winding down the employees, we have to make announcements to our customers and give them an option of how many months of production we will finish up and ship them before we stop production. Mm-hmm. We have to dispose of the equipment. They received tax benefits and abatements for putting the factory there. If they haven't, part of those abatements typically is that you're going to have X amount of income over so many years to reimburse the government for getting those initial tax credits. And if they haven't done that, then we may have to pay some of the tax credits back. So that's part of it too. So we're going through all of this. And one of the things that the US didn't recognize or realize, right now, the way China sets up corporations, 100% foreign-owned company is a WOFE, wholly owned foreign entity. When it has a Chinese partner and a US partner, it becomes a joint venture, which is a different company. So we can't just take the existing corporation and give him 20% of the shares. We actually have to turn it into a new type of company, from a WOFE to a joint venture. And then when he buys it, it will become a wholly owned Chinese entity, and it'll go from being a joint venture to a wholly owned Chinese company. So each one is a new set of corporate documents, a new set of articles of association, new general manager designations, all of these things. So I said to the client, the biggest issue is when we go from a Wolfie to a joint venture, that joint venture structure is what you're going to be using for the next 6 months to terminate all the employees, to sell all the equipment. And the Chinese government in the US, when you set up a company, you write an articles of association. Typically it's 1 page long. You throw it in a folder and you never look at it again. The government doesn't care about it. It's just something that has to get done. I can set up 10 companies. I can set up a company in the US in 2 hours online. And if I could use it to sell cars, I could use it to build homes, I could use it to be a doctor's office, I could use that same company for whatever I want. I could stop doing business in it and just leave it there. And as long as I paid my taxes, nobody cares. I don't have to close it. In China, I have to close it. I have to show that it's finished. If I change it from a car dealership to a doctor's office, I have to make a lot of changes to the company. So it's much more complicated. So I told them the joint venture structure is we need to control how the incorporation documents are written for the joint venture structure, because the government could go back to those documents for an indication and a structure of how can we terminate our employees? How can we sell the equipment? And if that's not written well, then it could become a roadblock. The incorporation documents, which again in the US are filed and put away and forgotten. But in China, they're actually used as a reference point by the government and the company when you're selling shares or terminating employees or selling equipment or whatever. So we need to make sure that those are written in such a way that it simplifies things for us to wind down the company properly. So that's where we are right now. The Chinese buyer has suggested that we use the Wolfie Incorporation, Articles of Incorporation, AOA. We use those and just make a couple changes. And I have to go through them first. I haven't done that yet. I have to go through them in detail and make sure that they're going to position us properly so that we can dispose of everything over the next 6 to 9 months. I've also told the US until this 20% sale goes through, until the money is out of China into the US bank account, and the 20% shares have been given to the buyer, I don't want to start terminating employees, telling customers, anything. Because in the current political situation, there has been a lot of conflict. And the US government has even said, potentially, some Chinese banks won't be allowed to transfer money back and forth between the US and China. We're closing consulates. So I don't know that the government's going to agree to transfer the 20% of the shares to the Chinese buyer, and both the bank and SAFE, the State Agency for Foreign Exchange, have to agree to allow the money to leave China and come into the US. And I said, until we know that happens, if they let the 20% over, then there's a very good chance they'll let the other 80% in 9 months. But let's get the 20% of the money first. Because once you start laying people off and getting rid of customers, now you don't even have a viable business in China anymore if you can't do this transaction, this sale. So that's a super interesting, project.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm very fortunate in that my background, I spent my 20s in manufacturing and operations in China, mostly in Asia.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
then in my 30s, I became a CPA and was living back in the US and worked for a CPA firm and did some interim CFO roles. And so a lot of my work is where we're blending the operations supply chain knowledge inside with the accounting and finance knowledge inside. So because they both, you need to really understand both
Yeah. Okay.
to craft the transactions. Go ahead. Sorry, I'm gonna have some
Yeah,
tea.
yeah. So also regarding supply chain, maybe something a bit different. I've wondered regarding, for example, the company you are consulting that has closed its production in China because it's not valuable or it's not gaining profit anymore, for example. What do you see for a change at the moment in the supply chain in China? Because, for example, in China, at the moment, there's a pretty international supply chain, right? Many Western producers are producing in China, but are they're engineers, but they are like building the product in their home country. For example, many German companies where I come from, like car manufacturers, um, they design the product in Germany and then they just build it in China, right? Do you maybe see a change towards also regarding the political
I,
difficulties right
I,
now to more,
I don't see a lot of companies closing, and I'll tell you why.
yeah,
So over the last more than 10 years ago, the companies that went to China to manufacture product and bring them back to Europe or the US.
yeah,
In the last 10 years, they've either changed their manufacturing direction to sell the product in China or at least Greater Asia, or companies have gone into China specifically to manufacture in China for China. So most of the automotive that I'm familiar with in China, foreign automotive, is not automotive that's exported back to, the parent company's or country
yeah.
of origin. It's sold in China. So I don't see any foreign company pulling out of that business. If anything, they're going to double down because the Chinese government is going to want more domestically made product, whether that domestic made product is a foreign owned company or a Chinese owned company. It's still domestic made product.
Mhm.
So they're going to want more domestic made product. So I think that the companies that are going to pull out are companies that are manufacturing in China mostly for export. They've not been very successful or profitable in the last 5 years because of management or cost increases, or their parent company's market, whatever it is. So if they're primarily export, if they have already not been all that successful for the last 5 years, those companies might pull out. But that frankly represents a very small portion of all the foreign owned manufacturing in China, because the majority of foreign owned manufacturing in China, especially in anything out of commodities, the higher technology product, is really being shipped in China, sold in China. It's not for export markets anymore. The Chinese owned manufacturing is more commodity based on a percentage. So like the foreign owned manufacturing in today's market 20 years ago was different. But in today's market, and this is all just, off the top of my head, but the foreign owned manufacturing in China, I'd say only 20-30% of it is commodity, inexpensive, low tech. The
Mhm.
higher level is higher tech, Apple iPhones and cars and high tech equipment and computer boards and all of those things. Those I think are going to stay. In
Mhm.
part because, well, and then the lower tech will leave. Now, on the Chinese owned side, it's probably more not 20%, 80%. It's 50-50, 50 low tech, low commodity, 50 high tech. So the 50% that's low tech, commodity product for export, the Chinese manufacturers are struggling with that because the export market is down because people aren't buying and shopping, and the tariffs and everything back and forth. So that's definitely hurting the Chinese companies. So that's a big change. But foreign companies, I think the majority of them that are still in China today, that didn't get out 5 years ago or 10 years ago, they're still there today. They're going to stay, because they're producing for the market in China. The other flip side of that is, where do you go? The US doesn't have a developed supply chain anymore for many of these manufacturers.
Mhm.
So you would still, and even in Vietnam, I was in Vietnam last year. I've been there before, but I was back last summer. And, even the manufacturers in Vietnam, their raw materials come from China, and the manufacturers in Thailand, a lot of their raw materials come from China. So you just can't cut China out of the supply chain. They're too too ingrained and there's too many layers to most supply chains that you can't just move them easily. The other problem we have in the US is companies have, especially right now, because there's a stimulus package with extra unemployment wages being paid by the government. But even before that, I would have clients with factories. Oftentimes they had one or two factories in the US, a factory in China, a factory in Mexico, maybe one in Poland. Their US factories, they could run more business in those factories, but they can't find workers. People don't want to do the repetitive factory level jobs. And so if there's a way for them to add robotics or high technology, then so that they don't need more workers, then more manufacturing could come back to the US. But there is a tremendous problem with getting employees. And that's where I had a client last summer who was, had a factory in China, a partner in China. They didn't own the factory. And they wanted that partner to invest, or they wanted to invest and expand it, because they had been trying for a year to expand their US production line, and they couldn't, because they couldn't find enough workers. So it's very easy to say that we want to reshore, and we want to bring, for politicians, we want to
Yeah.
bring production back, but for the actual business owners, it's not easy to do, because you can't find the employees. Your supply chain isn't here. The skills that you need sometimes for running the equipment isn't here anymore. So it's much more complicated. The
Okay.
whole global supply chain is very complicated.
Okay. Moving more towards these totally Chinese companies. Well, you have said it's more based on export and import, but is there like really no move towards more Chinese companies in the Chinese market?
Yes, the Chinese are definitely more nationalist. The younger generation's very nationalist, because that was a big part of their education, and I'm meaning 35 and under. So they definitely have a bias to buying Chinese domestic product in many product categories, not all, certainly. But and then there's a lot of innovation in China,
Yeah.
especially when they were on COVID lockdown. There were a lot of they created a lot of solutions to the problems that they were having with technology and everything during that time, and innovated some new technology and new products, and the market is very strong. So yeah, there's definitely, China has been moving towards um, expanding their domestic market so that they're not reliant on export. They also, from the 2008 recession that hit the US and Europe, before the recession, China was really serious about WTO and opening their markets, and complying with what they needed to for WTO. And then when the recession hit, and it hit because Western markets, particularly the US, were so unregulated that, we had financial crises, and, the exchange rates plummeted, and some countries in Ireland and Iceland and just took huge hits. And the Chinese government at the time said, whoa, if this is what an unregulated market does, we cannot have that happen here, because the only way they stay in power is if the society and economy is constantly slowly improving. And so
Yeah.
they can't take something like that. It would actually threaten their power more than anything else would. So when they saw that, they said, hell no, you know,
Mm.
we're not going to allow our currency to free float. We're not going to open up everything like this. The other reaction, and this is again my opinion, but the other reaction they had was what became the Belt Road Initiative. They said we're way too reliant on the US and Europe, which any good, at a company, any good sales manager or supply chain manager would have the same reaction. We've got this one company that represents 40% or 60% of our supply base or our customer base, and they've gone, batshit crazy. So we better not be reliant on them anymore. We better develop more diversified customers or diversified suppliers. So China has done the same thing in the last 10, 15 years. They've really worked towards, that's where they started investing in ports in Brazil. And, the Belt Road Initiative into Europe through, the stands and the North Arab peninsulas. So they started working through those areas in Africa and South America to create a supply chain and a customer base that was not European and American dependent. So consequently, they weren't specifically planning for Trump and the tariffs and the craziness that has ensued with that, but they were far enough down the road of deleveraging themselves from dependency on the West and US that they're able to weather this storm much better than they would have been 10 years ago. So that's critical too.
Okay. Do you still have time?
Sure. Yeah, one of the things you and I had talking about was just kind of how I got started in China. So maybe
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. Exactly. That's what I wanted to talk about.
another 10 minutes or so on that. But yeah, so I always say I moved to China in 1986 and I was 12, but it's not true. I wasn't 12. I moved to China after college. I studied international business in the US when it was a new degree in the mid 80s. Universities were just setting up international business programs. So I was fluent in Spanish at the time, and I thought that's not going to get me a job because it was the recession of 84, 85, 86 when I was graduating. And so I took a class in Asian cultures, and the Japanese typically are not open to foreigners or women. And I thought, I don't want to do that for the next 35 years of my life. So China, which had not had a lot of business at that point and wasn't very open, I thought it's, 1.4 billion people and it's starting to open. It's got to develop eventually. And I just felt comfortable with the Chinese culture. So I started taking Chinese at university and with my international business degree. And at the time, everyone said it's a stupid idea, super intellectual of you because Chinese is a difficult language, but it's never really going to help you. You're wasting your time. Now, of course, I look like a genius, right? But back then they thought it was a stupid idea. My university had an exchange program with China's premier language university, where two of us students could go there for a year and study Chinese, and two of their professors would come to the US university to learn how to teach English better. So at that time, China was more like North Korea. It was very closed. There were special laws for foreigners. There were
was just opening up, yeah.
Yeah, there were two currencies, the foreign exchange certificate that foreigners could use, and then the RMB for everyone else. So there were ways and methods to keep people, like our dormitories were foreigners only. The Chinese couldn't come even onto our part of campus. And who gets a scholarship from the Chinese government in 1986? Typically Eastern European. So my roommate was a professor from Czech, Prague, that was studying Chinese for a year to do a collaboration with the university in China. We had Pakistani military, we had African diplomats' kids, we had South American kids, we really didn't have, the Russians were kept even separate from the rest of the Europeans, Eastern Europeans. So we really only had a few Americans and maybe 10 Western Europeans in the school. Because it was just not allowed. They were just starting it out. So it was wonderful. I mean, that was a great year. And I always say I learned how to become a hustle. So I, set up my own, I had to make money because the scholarship money wasn't very much. So I leveraged there was a black market exchange rate for those foreign exchange certificates with the RMB. So I started taking, people would come into town to visit the embassy people or some of the few business people there. And they would want to go off the government approved tour because you had to stay with a government minder and you weren't allowed to take photos. And so I could take them on the buses and the back roads and into the markets. And so the deal was whatever they purchased, or spent, I would pay in the local currency. And at the end of the day, they would pay me back in the FEC currency, the foreign exchange. And then I could double that on the black market. So she can tell I was a black market dealer.
Okay.
That's how I made my money, right? So it was really funny. So I was there for a year, and then I ended up working for a company with business in China and Germany for short while. And then I came back to the US and was hired by a US company to go run their factories in a very small village on the Yangtze River northwest of Shanghai at the time, because there were no highways. At the time, it was about a 3 or 4 hour drive. Now it would be like an hour. So They hired me, and I had never been in a factory in my life. And so after I said yes, because that's my personality. I'm like, sure. And this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in operations. So it was exactly what I wanted. So I moved to Shanghai, and I remember like 2 weeks in, I was on my way to the factory in the van with the Chinese employees. The American guy that had set up the factories had gone back to the US. And I'm on my way to the factory, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, like, what did I get myself into? Is it this big? Is it this big? Like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And I got out there, and it's, everything, whether it's accounting or production and operations or engineering, fundamentally it's inputs and outputs. It's 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 2 is 4. You have these materials coming in, you modify them, you have these finished goods going out. It's all very logical. And there's different languages to production. There's a language to accounting, there's a language to finance. But fundamentally, there's the same underlying logic to all of it. So you learn to speak the language of it, work in process, and your yield ratios, but they're all fundamentally like very simple logical things. And I'm very pattern minded, so I'm very good at that sort of thing, anyways. So I ran the factories for 2 years. About 6 months in, I said to the owner, the U.S. owner, I said, "Why did you hire me?" Because they knew I had no idea, right? And I was doing good. I waited till I knew they were really happy with me and they thought I was doing a good job. And he said, well, we realized after talking to you that the guy we had before had 30 years manufacturing experience, but he didn't understand China. He didn't speak Chinese. He couldn't navigate the people and the systems, and he was constantly, butting his head against, this is how I want it to be, and they're not listening to me. Whereas you had been a student in China for a year, and you understood, I had been in a very Chinese environment, without a lot of, I always say foreigners typically have an arm's length relationship when in
Yeah.
China,
I
because
haven't been in China yet, though.
you haven't.
I haven't. I
Um,
I, I plan to go this year as soon as
yeah,
possible.
I hope you can go. But
Yeah.
most foreigners, they need a translator, and they
Yeah.
come to China in their 30s or 40s, and so their mind is already set about how we do things at home is the right way, and I need to change the Chinese, right?
Mhm.
And for me, I started in China, so the Chinese way was the right way for me because that's what I learned,
Yeah.
was how to manage the Chinese way, how to communicate and work and everything. So I was there for 5 years in total, a year at university, 2 years running the factories, and then 2 years managing their Asian outpost in Hong Kong,
Mhm.
traveling all over Asia and meeting with customers and suppliers at like 27 years old. So when I came back to the US and had to get a job in the US, it was a huge culture shock for me because I didn't know how to be American. I look like this, right? But I was very Chinese because I
Mhm.
had been with all Chinese people for the first 5 years of my career. Even though I was managing it, I was learning from them how to negotiate and manage and do business. And so when I got back to the US, I did everything wrong, according to the American way. I didn't manage the American way. I didn't articulate or communicate with my peers or my supervisors. So I had to really very consciously learn how to do things the American way. And so a big part of what I do today in my consulting is I understand the technical, and I always tell university students, you really need to build a technical expertise in the first few years of your career, because you don't want to be that guy who got into consulting or management right out of college and didn't build a technical skill. And here you are in your 30s trying to manage people who have those skills and you have zero credibility. So it's better to build a technical skill in your 20s and then get into management in your later 20s and 30s where you can leverage that skill, plus your management ability. So I've developed that, and I'm a very technical person by nature anyways. But on top of that, I have a very intuitive understanding of Chinese business and transaction and perspective and communication and thought, because your brain is wiring between like 20 and 24, 25, your brain is wiring judgment and reason and decision making. And I did that in a fully Chinese environment, and so I even today, after being back in the US for more than 20 years, and I'm in China usually 5 or 6 times a year, but even today I will look back on a decision I made and 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and there's a lot of Chinese perspective and values in the decisions that I make and the way that I operate. And it's very funny because even my children who raised and grown up, born and raised here in the US, because of my influence in parenting, they typically are friends with first generation immigrants, or kids that are not kind of mainstream American. And they, 2 out of the 3 anyways, like any opportunity to use their passport and go to Switzerland for 3 weeks in the middle of winter and work their, backpack their way down to Turkey, or, go to Iceland and camp for 2 weeks or whatever. They have a very different perspective and way of thinking than I would say the typical American mindset is. So, the more you can travel in your youth, and not just travel, but really integrate yourself into a community and have to function the way they function, and not have the ability to swipe a credit card and stay in a hotel because it becomes inconvenient, or have somebody come bail you out, but really have to work through problems and challenges. And I was in China through Tiananmen Square. I was living in Shanghai when all of that happened, and I stayed for another 6 months. So I had a lot of, I worked my way through a lot of challenges and conflicts in China. And I love, I think it comes through to my clients and when I speak, but I love China, and it's my home. I'm constantly on LinkedIn trying to get people to understand, with Americans, if they really supported Obama, Trump is not their president. If they really support Trump, Obama was not their president. And if they're a Trump supporter, when Obama was president, would they have wanted to be judged by him? And would people that hate Trump today, would they want to be judged as a Trump American? Is that who they are? And they would say, both sides would say, absolutely not. Well, then why are you judging the Chinese by Xi Jinping? And they have less control over that. They can't even vote for him. At least you can vote here, right? So you have some responsibility for who you end up with. And there it's kind of out of their control, of who they have leading them. And that doesn't mean they're not nationalists to their government. I'm American and I'm proud to be American, whether I like this president or not, and no matter how concerned I am about the things that are happening in my country and the decisions that are being made, that doesn't make me less of a patriotic person. And it shouldn't make the Chinese less patriotic. If we should expect them to be patriotic and to be loyal to their country and their nation. And that doesn't mean they're loyal to their political system per se. So I think people have, especially Americans, have a very hard time separating those things. But so yeah, I love what I do. It's going to be very difficult for me. I can't see myself going back to China until next summer, just because of the visa situation not being allowed. And I don't think anybody really will be allowed in the country until after Chinese New Year next year, if things have completely settled down. So that's difficult because I have a lot of very close friends, and it's been a big part of my business, the work that I do when I'm there. But yeah, so lovely talking to you.
Yeah, exactly. Was a good and also perfect. Yeah, great.